And it's my pleasure now to welcome to the program Alfie Kohn. He is the author of 14 books to date, centered around human behavior, education, and parenting. But today we're going to home in on a very specific subject, notably expressed in his book titled No Contest: The Case Against Competition. Alfie, thank you so much for taking the time today. We really appreciate it.
Glad to be here.
And let me start by pointing out this sort of cultural phenomenon that from the nature of the educational system to most recreational games or sports to the very structure and incentives of the global economy, this expression of competition is absolutely ubiquitous out there. And one of the things that seems to hold all this together is a series of narratives, a series of stories that we've been told about the supposed value of this winners versus losers antagonism. Would you mind giving a kind of overview of those established narratives?
Well, I organized the book along the lines of several myths that we're raised with to the point that we don't even recognize them as myths or, for that matter, even narratives, and come to believe it's just an accurate perception of life itself, which is, it's a dog eat dog world out there. Or given how we teach that even to tiny children, we could say a doggy eat doggy world out there, that competition is just part of human nature, so there's nothing we can do about it. It's more productive. People are motivated to do their best when they're set against others, so the goal becomes victory. Competition builds character, and so on. I should be clear that when you look at a given task, there's really three ways you can go about it. One way is to compete so that I can succeed only if you fail, which I call mutually exclusive goal attainment, which is a fancy term that means I succeed only if you fail. Another possibility, of course, is I succeed regardless of what the hell you do, which is a more individualistic arrangement. And then the third possibility is I succeed only if you succeed too. We sink or swim together, which is a formally cooperative arrangement. So I want to make that clear that there's three alternatives, whether we're talking about workplace or classroom or the kids or adults, because step one, I argue, should be at least moving to an individualistic approach, which is not particularly friendly or neighborly, but at least much less destructive than competition, so
Yes.
that at least we're not required to interfere with each other's performance. You can make a given environment non-competitive. Step two, in many cases, would be to make it affirmatively cooperative, but there is that intermediate step as well.
And going back to these kind of myths once again, you've done such tremendous research on the social study, the evidence-based scientific study. And
Yeah.
can you give some examples of some of these core contradictions you see between, again, these myths and what the science actually says when it comes to the fruits or lack thereof of competition?
Well, when I went into this project, I was already convinced that competition was not great for our psychological health. That if we have to spend our lives trying to defeat others and fend off others who are trying to defeat us, this is not going to be great for the way we feel about ourselves and our sense of balance in the world. And the research proved that correct. I don't know how many people mistrust that or already accept it, but when you plumb people, when you invite them to reflect on it, I think a lot of people realize that winners as well as losers are perpetually in a state of doubt about their own status, their own competence, their own value, because even when you succeed, it's only temporary, and your sense of self-confidence and self-esteem is perpetually conditional. That is, you're only as good as the number of people you've defeated lately. And that's a recipe for neurosis. The research also shows a great deal of harm in terms of our relationship with other people. Interpersonally, we're desperately trying to be a winner, and we envy other winners. We are contemptuous of losers, and we're suspicious of and defensive about just about everybody, because even if you're not my rival today, you could be tomorrow. And in fact, the research demonstrates here that competition is enormously destructive to people's social and moral status. Children who are placed in competitive situations are less generous, more likely to tend toward envy, and less able or willing to imagine how the world looks from other people's points of view, which psychologists call perspective taking. That is one of the groundwork, the foundations of a moral way of life. What's interesting about the research on those first 2 points about psychological health and relationships is the problem isn't just when competition is done badly or to excess or too early in life. These problems are inherent to any arrangement that says I can succeed only if you fail. And that's sort of a running theme throughout my book, is to talk about how you can't solve the problem by just putting competition in its place, by doing it a little less overtly, or telling kids, just be a good sport about it, and so on.
Right.
The problem is not with the implementation of competition. The problem is with the very idea of competition. Anyway, what I did not expect when I went into this project was that competition is also destructive to performance, to productivity, to achievement. I confess that I thought that a less competitive society might be a healthier and happier one, but we might have to give up some achievement. And here I was dead wrong. What the research overwhelmingly indicates is that competition tends to hold us back from doing our best. And in fact, study after study has shown across cultures, across genders, across ages, and across tasks, that if you take a whole bunch of people and half of them you ask to do a given task, solve a puzzle, for example, and the other half given the identical task but told there'll be a prize for whoever does this best, the people in the first group tend to outperform the people in the second group. In other words, there's something about competition that actually interferes with bottom line achievement, so competition turns out to be as counterproductive as it is unhealthy.
And of course, you look at other examples in the economy in particular, it's just a skewed motivation, you would agree. It's when people are trying to, say, sell something, that's very different than trying to maybe develop a product that actually has public use, right? And then you can enter the field of marketing and advertisement. And in a way, if you think about marketing and advertisement, it's really a kind of, it's another form of the competitive embrace that deepens into manipulation. And let's change gears a little bit here. You mentioned in your book this kind of structural versus intentional dichotomy, the difference between someone that's trained in the sense of valuing competition, like parents through sports and whatnot, and then people that are exposed or born into structures that basically force that incentive. Can you define those distinctions and talk about their relevance?
Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily say born into. You can walk into it on a given Wednesday.
Right.
So this is just sort of a schema for understanding the whole idea of competition. By structural competition, I mean when the rules of the game, so to speak, sometimes a literal game, sometimes figuratively speaking, are set up so that there's no way I can achieve what I'm trying to do unless I make sure that other people don't. I may not desire that. I may not be the kind of person who enjoys competition or wants other people to lose, but there's no way for me to get that job or succeed at in this literal game on the field, or do well according to what my teachers determine, and so on, unless other people don't. So that's not a function of personal desire, it's a function of the system.
Right.
Intentional competition refers to individuals who, even though there is no prize being given out, there's no requirement that they defeat others, they feel a compulsion to do so. They don't feel successful unless they are winners, which is, of course, completely different from being excellent at something. And
Right.
by the way, that those two concepts, I think anybody would have to agree, are different, at least in theory. I can I can write a book or cook a meal or build a house without ever being concerned that it outdoes somebody else's, right? I
Yeah.
can just be concerned to do it as well as I possibly can. And yet we constantly conflate the two ideas. Even before we get to the empirical question of whether competition enhances or detracts from excellence, we have to admit they're two different ideas.
Right.
And yet we don't. In fact, we use the word competitive and attribute it to a corporation or a whole company, or school systems even, where our district is competitive. And what we mean by that seems to be really good, even though the word implies that we have to outdo others. So we have to start by teasing apart the difference between excellence and victory. And then we look at the research to find that the more focused you are on victory, the less likely you are to be excellent, particularly at tasks that require ingenuity or creativity. But anyway, the main point is there's a balance here, and we have to look both at the psychological issues of people who are intentionally competitive. For example, if you want the apotheosis of this kind of psychopathology, you look at our felon in chief. I mean, I've been using Donald Trump as an example of how not to be a human being for a long time. And while there are many aspects to his psychopathology, malignant narcissism among them, most of, as I wrote in an article back in 2015, most of his personality, of his dysfunction, is based on the idea that I've got to be better than everybody at everything. And he sees all other human beings as potential rivals. We've all met these kind of people, the kind of folks who have to out debate you at a dinner party and so on, even though there are no prizes being given out for that. They look around the room and are concerned that they're the most attractive or the funniest or whatever, even in the absence of structural competition. So I guess I started this project by thinking about those two in some kind of balance, and both are important. But gradually, as I've thought more about this over the years, I've come to believe that the structural aspects are far more important and tend to drive the individual, the psychological aspects of this. I remember when the book came out, I commented to somebody that if people started accepting this research and questioning these beliefs, you would start to see books in the other books in the bookstore in the self-help section called 10 Steps to a Less Competitive You, because our society is so individualistic
Yeah.
that we tend not to look at systemic or structural causes of problems. We tend to think it's just a matter of your attitude, your mindset, your orientation, and we're each left on our own to solve the problem.
Absolutely, I could not agree more, and we'll touch upon that a little bit more in a moment. You made some excellent points there. Of course, I've always considered Donald Trump sort of an archetype of the amalgamation of our culture, both structurally
Yep.
induced and, of course, his psychology. You also mentioned something interesting regarding debate. I've always found it fascinating when you watch people debate, which is supposed to be some kind of investigation of a given subject, and it should be thoughtful and using evidence and such. But no, when we watch debates, particularly political ones, what's the end result? It's about who won the debate, as if that's a thing, and it's just truly incredible how ubiquitous this kind of thinking is.
And that's built into the concept of debate.
Right,
I mean, we can disagree with each other in a discussion,
right,
but in a debate, the point is not to seek the truth.
right.
The point is to outperform your opponent. I have described myself most of my life as a recovering debater. I was a very successful high school debater, and
Wow,
it took me years before I was able to say, that's a good point. I never thought of that,
right.
because you're trained to win,
Yeah,
not to be right,
yeah,
and that's true of all debates. As for Trump, by the way, in a healthy society, a man like that would be viewed as an object of pity.
absolutely. Absolutely.
But this is what happens when you get psychopathology in a dysfunctional culture that offers support for his pathology instead of seeing him as an object of derision or somebody who needs a great deal of help.
Let's shift gears here, a slightly different subject. We'll come back to the structural issue. I was really fortunate to come back and read your book again. I've read it twice now. It does such an excellent job, and I encourage everyone to read it, of addressing another thing that's been long propagated by competitive proponents, and that is a kind of desperate attempt to link competition to some immutable human nature, from Thomas Hobbes to, in fact, a range of Western philosophers. It's almost as if, Western philosophy as a whole has intoned this idea as a form of justification that the early humans, the primitive humans, were the embodiment of our deepest nature, deeply warring, aggressive, and violent. And you've sourced people like Margaret Mead, cybernetician, anthropologist, who did great research in the early 20th century. And there are some others in the modern era, even though they're kind of few and far between, such as David Graeber or behavioral
Yep.
biologist Robert Sapolsky. And they continue to pose these arguments that we've been misled about this idea that we have this ingrained warring, the whole society is basically a warring construct. This is something I've talked about a great deal and have also written about. But what has been your experience with this, even in the modern day? Do you still run up against this narrative?
Yeah, not just with respect to competition. I mean, you've sort of blurred competition and aggression,
Right.
um, but there's any number of things that are just casually attributed to human nature, and they all tend to be negative.
Yeah.
Now, nobody says, well, of course he helped that person out. It's just human nature to be generous.
Right. Right.
It's just human nature to be competitive, aggressive, territorial, lazy, stubborn, all the bad stuff. Which is pretty interesting, this sort of extremely doer view we have of our species. And it's interesting to think about where that comes from, how religion might be involved, and so on. And I return to it in my next book, which is called The Brighter Side of Human Nature, where the first chapter, again, why we keep attributing negative stuff to human nature and whether the research supports it. I mean, when you think about it, the quick attribution of the status quo to our human nature is very convenient because it relieves us of any obligation to have to make improvements in our society, especially of an enduring and deep nature. Oh yeah, sure, it would be nice if people were cooperative, but shrug. It's just human nature to compete. You can't do anything about it. And therefore, it doesn't matter how unjust and counterproductive it is. It's idealistic, which is a pejorative to have ideals, to think that you can make any meaningful change because the problem is built in. So we're permitted to just put up with all the bad stuff because it's part of our DNA, we like to say very easily. And so in this book, I pulled evidence from, first of all, cross-cultural anthropology, starting with, as you said, Margaret Mead, to show that there have been quite a number of non-industrialized cultures where there is apparently no competition, not in the way they play games and have fun, not in the way they distribute resources, not in the way they raise children, nothing, which is very interesting. And by the way, all you need is one such culture to disprove the idea that it is inevitable, that it's innate.
Yes.
And indeed, what we tend to find is that the cultures closest to nature, so to speak, the ones that are less industrialized, are not always non-competitive, but are more likely to be non-competitive. There's evidence from all kinds of fields that converge on the idea that, to sum it all up, we're competitive because we're raised that way, not because we're born that way.
When people bring up this human nature to me, I always source back to a quote I read that it's really our nature to be quite variable. We have incredible adaptability, but that also makes us extremely vulnerable to the environments that we're in. In fact, in one of my books, I wrote about the social dominance theorists, which I'm not sure if you're familiar with, these people that construed the idea that upon the Neolithic Revolution, because there was a surplus for some reason generated the need for people to want to dominate each other, to hoard more resources as a kind of abstracted scarcity
There's a guy who challenged a lot of that named Andy Schmuckler, a book called The Parable of the Tribes
Okay.
some years ago, where
Okay.
he took on some of this, but I'm not sure I'm familiar with all those people. But it does take a certain degree of almost willful myopia. I mean, the bar should be very high to attribute anything to human nature, because you're saying, in effect, that this has been true of all cultures and it's always been true through history and it must always be true. There's not a lot you can really make that case for. There are some things perhaps, but one ought to be very humble about making such claims. And again, always ask the question, which I think is implicit in your talking about the unjust political implications and ways in which those claims are made, which is cui bono? Who benefits from these claims?
Good point. Yeah, it serves a kind of hierarchical power system,
Yes.
and an oppressive one, to have people believe this kind of stuff. I've often commented that competition is sort of the best value structure that upholds power, and for the worst, because we all know that the structure is kind of slanted, and if everyone believes in fighting, then the people that really have the advantage in that game are going to persist and they're going to maintain their dominance. So let's move on. There's a nuance in something that you wrote that I thought was very interesting. It kind of surprised me because even though I've done research into this myself, but so many people attribute scarcity stress to a kind of reactionary psychology, social psychology, that people
Uh-huh.
assume naturally leads to a competitive attitude. And you
Right.
write in your book that there actually isn't evidence for this, and that some cultures, and it also makes perfect sense, will actually bond together in a far more collaborative effort, in fact, to conquer scarcity issues. Would you talk about that a little bit? Because it's very counterintuitive, I think, to people.
Yeah, that goes back to Margaret Mead's early studies and those of other anthropologists. I mean, imagine a 2 by 2 table, okay, where there's societies where there's plenty of stuff, and societies where stuff is perpetually scarce. Those could be the columns. And now the rows in this little table are responding competitively and responding cooperatively. So what the anthropologists are just telling us is that you can populate all four of those cells. In other words, there's examples of societies where there's scarcity and they're competitive, scarcity and they're cooperative, plenty and they're competitive, plenty and there's cooperative. And that means, in effect, that in some societies where there's stuff is scarce, like food, for example, the response is we can't afford to compete. We have to cooperate because it's not adaptive to be
Yes.
trying to outdo each other. So it just means that when societies are cooperative or competitive, it's a function of something having to do with the culture itself that is often passed on over generations. It is not a necessary function of the objective state of how much stuff there is.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. I remember the COVID-19 pandemic, you had this behavior of people hoarding supplies. And someone may, intuitively look at that and say, well, this just means this some socio-biological reaction to scarcity. But really, people have been given this scarcity mindset for so long in the culture, even though it's totally abstracted. They just run out and feel the need to hoard. There's such a great correlation between that scarcity mindset and hoarding behavior. So the cultural element is definitely very pronounced. Moving on and speaking of how we can kind of change this stuff,
Yeah.
the core of your work in childhood development is truly fantastic, and that's the majority of the study that you've put forward, if I understand correctly. And I've read a good portion of it, and I've always followed that and really believed in part that obviously we have to impart proper values and conditioning onto children because it carries over into adulthood. And the educational system, we really have this sort of arcane, uh, highly hierarchical, grade-oriented, competitive gaming kind of psychology in the entire educational system.
First of all, with respect to the whole human nature claim, it is rather ironic that if it's just human nature to compete, why the hell do we spend so much time carefully socializing children to do that
Yeah.
and to accept it as natural? That would be redundant if we had no choice about it. But in fact, we are training children from the earliest days. I use the example, the first game that I ever learned at a birthday party in which N children scrambled desperately for N minus one chairs.
Yeah.
You know, that's a prototype of artificial scarcity. And you start learning this is what it means to have fun, is you have to make sure you triumph over the other people who came out to play. And when you get that message on the weekends and in the late afternoons, along with spelling bees and awards assemblies and but who's sitting nice and quiet if you get to go to lunch first, and on and on and on in elementary school, you get the message that life is about beating people. Other people are potential obstacles to your own success, which is the central message of the American elementary school. And it is destructive on many levels. First of all, it trains children to accept this as inevitable and dampens any inclination to make change. But it also, as I indicated as we began talking, undermines self-esteem, destroys relationships, interferes with excellence, because children learn better in cooperative learning groups when they're in pairs or small teams, learning with and from one another, according to the research, than they do left to their own devices, and certainly learn more effectively than when they're pitted against each other in a perpetual contest. And that continues to be the case as you go up through school.
Yeah.
The other thing that competition does, besides undermining those things, and which is also related to the achievement effects, is competition, like other rewards, tends to undermine intrinsic motivation, which means a desire to do things for their own sake.
Yeah.
So it doesn't have to be competition. That's just the most toxic variant. But any sort of extrinsic reason for doing something, a sticker, a gold star, a grade, $1, a pizza, offered conditionally on success, tends to make people less interested in whatever they had to do to get that reward. And I wrote another whole book about that called Punished by Rewards. But my point here is that the only thing worse than a reward is an award. See the difference?
Yeah.
An award is a reward that has been made artificially scarce.
Yeah.
So not all grades are competitive.
Mhm.
A teacher can say, the point in here is to get an A, and I hope all of you get an A. All of you can if you do this quality of work. So my heart sinks, because this is not a classroom that's about learning. Learning has now been made into a tedious prerequisite, something you have to get through in order to get the good grade. But if you really, really wanted to destroy both excellence and interest, you would say, not only is the point in here to get an A, but only a few of you are going to be able to get the A. I'm going to rank you. You're going to be graded on a curve. Now I've taken a bad thing and made it even worse. It's like adding the arsenic of extrinsic motivation to the strychnine of competition. And each of these aspects of childhood and education has alternatives that turn out to be not just more pleasant, but a hell of a lot more productive and constructive. And I added, when I did the revised version of No Contest several years after its publication, the one big chapter that I clonked myself over the head because I realized it was missing and important is to talk in detail about what cooperative learning means in a classroom. So there are alternatives, and some people get them, and they are implemented in some classrooms and schools, but obviously not enough.
Yeah. And I really encourage parents out there to absolutely investigate the work that you're doing. It's just so pivotal. I remember from my own education, just the nature of how things are pushed in terms of motivation. I remember, for example, I grew up as a classical musician, and it was a very competitive environment, entering
Yep.
concerto competitions and things of that nature. And it really did stifle a sense of development. It also generated, again, as you pointed out earlier, a tendency for inferiority where you're dealing with sensitive performance issues or learning where so many of my friends, they just did not feel, they didn't enjoy playing music, I would say. They felt so intimidated by the environment. In fact, when I was in elementary school studying musical studies, the teacher would give us, as you pointed out, little stars for how well we performed a given passage of music. And at the end of the semester or what have you, they would give us some reward if you had the most stars. So what did we degenerate percussionists do? We broke into the lockers of all the violin players and stole their stars. Which again speaks to how it corrupts people's sense of motivation. Of course,
And
that's
their interest in music, yeah. I mean, high school, they have music festivals, which are not really festivals at all. They're contests. I love the way we warp the use of language. Or same with science fairs, which are not really fairs. We ruin it by turning it into a contest. In orchestras, there are challenges to be first chair and so on. And I've talked to a number of music educators who have tried to push back against all of this, to rotate kids through different chairs in the orchestra and so on, so they can hear each other play, not so you have to ruin it by turning it into a contest.
Yeah. And let's conclude the conversation by
Yeah.
going back to something you said at the beginning, which I completely agree with regarding the importance of structural change, whether it's the educational tradition or whether it's the economy and the social system at large. I don't know, it's such a strange conversation to have, especially politically, when you start to criticize the structure of, say, market capitalism or market economics, which I think we'd all agree is a kind of near zero-sum game environment. It's scarcity based. It's kind of hard to be collaborative in a system that doesn't really reward that. And I just want to
Yeah.
get your final thoughts on that issue. People have this, again, this diffused propagandized sense, I believe, where they say, well, that's just socialism or that doesn't work. Or if people are collaborative in their economic ways, it will lead to gulags like in some Soviet whatever. What round this out with your opinion on all of that?
Well, I mean, the last is a matter of tendentious rhetoric separate from the substantive arguments about competition. There will always be people who will use poorly chosen historical examples to fend off meaningful change, or to conflate democracy with capitalism,
Right.
or socialism with Soviet communism. I forget if it was Mike Harrington or Noam Chomsky who pointed out that, ironically, the United States and the Soviet Union as adversaries shared one thing, which is it was in both their interests to pretend that Marx's democratic socialism was equivalent to what the Soviet Union was doing.
Yes.
See, the Soviets could point to that as proof that we're completely consistent with, aligned with Marx's humanist vision, which is false.
Mm.
And the Americans could point to that conflation, that confusion, in order to justify not having democracy in the economic realm, which
Yes.
is what democratic socialism is all about. People will always do that, use socialism as, or these days even liberalism, as an epithet, not as a label for an economic alternative. And this requires us to work on a lot of levels to question the whole idea of competition as a good. I'm not an economist, but when I look at the research on individual workplaces and find persuasive evidence demonstrating that people in a workplace or teams or divisions within a company or organizations pitted against each other in competition tend not to do good work. The great guru of quality in workplaces, the late W. Edwards Deming, was somebody who realized and for a while persuaded a lot of Fortune 500 executives that if there's competition in your organization is not going to reach quality because people are too busy trying to beat each other to become really good at what they do. And so I just take a step back and say, if the research is this clear about competition being counterproductive in individual workplaces, how is it we're so sure that that same philosophy of having to defeat people makes sense writ large
Right.
on the macro scale? And I know that's work that you've done a lot more of than I have, to look at alternatives and to understand the problems with competition um, in an entire society, in an entire economic system. But the point is that I think where you and I agree and are doing work that complements each other is to recognize that we have to ask not just the, the, the superficial questions of implementation, but to ask the deeper questions, the radical questions. Radical, as I think you know, comes from the Latin meaning root, the root question. Not just are we competing too much or in the wrong way, but why are we building from competition itself? And the other thing I think we're trying to do is help people to realize that you're not some starry-eyed utopian
Right.
if you question this stuff,
Right.
because to the extent it lends itself to empirical confirmation or disconfirmation, as opposed to being just a statement of values, the reality is that competition simply isn't very effective. Even with a hard-bitten, hard-boiled, bottom line kind of set of criteria by which to judge an economic system or a classroom or a family or a playing field, competition tends to be not just unpleasant, it tends to be counterproductive with respect to most of the criteria that most of us value.
Absolutely. And that is definitely a revelation that hopefully we can impart and get society back on the right track. I'll conclude by saying that even though competition is considered an interpersonal or intergroup affair, I think there's some truth to the fact that we've embedded this psychology so deeply that we are basically in competition with the planet, with nature. We're not we're substituting our own idea of this growth system, for example, completely in contradiction to the way we have to be sustainable on the planet. And I think that's, of course, an extension of this, but that's another thing that definitely troubles me in this sort of mindset that maybe we could attribute it to religion, I guess, on some level, in the sense of humans being special and impervious to the laws of nature. But at the same time, I think our exploitative perspective, our scarcity-oriented perspective, which quite bizarrely translates into a need for infinite consumption and this sort of paradox of our economy. We have a scarcity mindset, but yet the growth economy, as you know, is very much infinitely growth oriented. It's a bizarre situation we have in the current paradigm out there. But Alfie, I really appreciate it, and good luck with all your work, and I will continue promoting it, and I really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much. Appreciate your interest in your own work.
Thank you. Take care.